Thanks a lot. So basically the idea was that we probably go through that about half an hour or so, and then if you have questions afterwards, that would be great. There are basically three parts. The first part that I wanted to talk about is more like an abstract general idea of what is privacy, why is it important, some more like philosophical thoughts about all of that. And then the second part is basically most of what I did so far was on Facebook, what they actually do with data, and just to give you kind of a practical part afterwards of what that means in practice, of what data is really stored where, what happens with the data once it's online. I basically started doing more on that when I was a student in California. I was studying there for half a year in the Silicon Valley, and at the time I had to write a paper. It should have been 20 pages, and I should have submitted it. I still have it incomplete there because I never submitted the paper. But for writing the paper, I asked for my data from Facebook, and anybody in Europe has the right to get a copy of the data the company holds on you. So you can just send an email and say, hey, I want to have all the data you have on me. And at the time, I got a CD from Facebook with a PDF on, and it was 1,200 pages. And I used Facebook for about 3 years at the time. That was in 2011. And I was the person that posted something like once a week or so. I was really not a heavy user. But still, within 3 years, they had 1,200 pages of data. This whole thing became kind of, especially in Central Europe, like a media hype. It was all over the news and newspapers and all got crazy. And it was funny because I just filed a couple of complaints at the Irish data protection regulator. Basically in Europe, each country has a data protection authority that is in charge of these things. And because most of these big companies avoid taxes, they are usually in Luxembourg or Ireland. So you usually end up in these two countries because that's where you don't pay taxes. So all the international companies have their headquarters there. So these companies regulate our privacy. Like if I'm an Austrian, actually the Irish regulator regulates my privacy, not the Austrian regulator. And that's basically how a lot of these cases came up. And it was interesting to me that I was at the time a student, and I was 23 or so. And I just felt, I'm a law student, or I'm a lawyer now. And I just filed a couple of complaints, which is not a big deal. And it became a huge media hype that, you know, someone ever did something about it. And it was kind of funny because it was literally 2 evenings with a bottle of wine, and suddenly it was a thing. So into the philosophical thing, the interesting stuff is obviously that we now have all these new technologies that we talk about 24/7, and that usually has an impact with privacy because it's so many things are now technically possible that were not possible 20 or 30 years ago. If you look at, I don't know, the Eastern German Stasi operations, they hardly had 1,200 pages on a person. Like they had 10 pages, 20 pages on a person. But by now it's automated and possible to generate this information like crazy, like 1,200 pages you can probably generate in a day or two through computers. And that usually has an impact with privacy because it's just possible to put everybody under surveillance, for example. When it comes to privacy, I think it's important to differentiate between kind of 2 different layers of privacy. We usually talk about privacy in general, but if we talk about privacy, there's kind of 2 different issues that we have. The first issue is best probably demonstrated by that picture. It's from Cuba. It's a what do you call it? A prison. And the idea is you have one prison guard in this tower in the middle, and all the prison cells around. This place is broken down, but you can see the prison cells individually. No one is actually going to be able to surveil all these prison cells at the same time. But by that guard being in the middle tower and having windows where you can see through the other way, everybody in all of these cells has the feeling of surveillance. So they feel like if they do something wrong, that guard could look at me right now. And that changes their behavior, even though they're factually not even under surveillance. And that is basically this one level of privacy where we change our behavior because we're in public, because we feel that something is tracked. People do not speak out as openly if they're in a big auditorium as they speak out if they're with 2 friends. So that is this general feeling of surveillance that can change a society or a behavior as we have it, and that can limit your freedoms to a certain extent. It can also be a positive thing, like if there is, let's say, CCTV people don't steal that much because they feel, okay, this camera could probably look at me. But that is the one level of privacy. The other level is an actual misuse of the data, an actual consequence from data. For example, if you ask for a credit and you're denied because some credit ranking agency says you're not a good risk, you don't have enough money for this credit, which may be wrong, like oftentimes these credit rankings are incorrect. But that's more of the actual consequence from a interference with your data. And I think these two levels are important to separate. If, for example, that's a picture of me at a electronics store in Vienna from a CCTV camera. And these cameras basically do these two things. On the one hand, they deter people to steal because they feel like they're under surveillance. In theory, you could then actually, when someone steals something, actually get the picture and do something about it. The reality is most of the times these pictures are so bad that you're never going to be able to do anything with it. And so I was talking to police people in Austria and they said, you know, what are we going to do with like a picture of someone stealing something for 50 euros? Plaster it all over the city, or, you know, we're never going to find that person anyways. But just as a side note, that many of these things sometimes don't work. All of this is connected to freedoms, obviously. The more we have limitations in our privacy, the more we usually have secondary rights violated. For example, if you feel like everything you're saying online, every comment you make is going to be tracked, you may limit your freedom of speech to a certain extent. So there are a lot of other freedoms that may limit itself once you feel that there is data involved. Which gets me to another issue, which is this general nothing to hide argument. Is like if you did nothing wrong, then there is no reason why you should worry about any of it. And I mean, I mentioned a couple of these cases already. There is, for example, freedom of speech, which is something that is not illegal at all, but totally legal and something we want to foster. But the more people feel like everything is captured, the more they probably limit what they want to say. Another example that I usually like a lot is anything that's like sexuality, relationship, and so on. It's the whole reason why we all existed, because someone had sex. But that is usually highly private matter. and that is something where you can see that there's not necessarily a logical link between privacy and what we actually do, because how do you explain this? The simplest way to say that, like, there's no reason, like logical reason, why sexuality is a private matter. It's a cultural phenomenon. We feel like sexuality is something we do in private. Dogs do that on the street as well. And that's different than, for example, the freedom of speech, where there is a logical link between I have a boss and if I say something, then a consequence happens. But a lot of these privacy issues are highly cultural and not really fully possible to explain. And I think that's oftentimes interesting as well, to just accept, so to say, that there are certain things that we just feel culturally to be private without having to necessarily explain why. To give you another example on that cultural side, for example, I was backpacking in China, and I think a week later we're in Japan. In China, there were like bathroom stalls where the wall was this high, so you could basically look over to the next person in the bathroom. And so no privacy there whatsoever. And then you're in Japan, where they have like buttons to make flush sounds and so on, so that no one ever hears what's going on there. So it's like, you know, geographically very close to each other, but culturally very different on that. Another one where you can explain privacy quite well is, for example, the voting situation. Like, you only have the total freedom to vote whichever party you want to vote for, if that election process is really, really private. That's the reason we have voting booths. For example, in Austria, we for a long time have the right-wing Freedom Party. And it's interesting that in polls, they poll much lower than in actual elections, because even if they just have to click, like if they get a call, it's like, who are you going to vote for next weekend? People do not say I vote for the Freedom Party because they feel ashamed of it. Once they're in the private voting booth, then they go for the Freedom Party. And there you can see how privacy changes the behavior and probably gets the real will of people out. This voting thing was probably the reason why this picture got viral, because someone did not respect the privacy of the next person. And we would be interesting to see what she really voted for. And all of this is connected to power. A lot of the information means you have power over another person. To give you a simple example, if you have a transaction, it's oftentimes a bit like a poker game. For example, if you book a flight, the airline industry had the idea that you first have to put your name in and your frequent flyer number and all of your details, and then you get a personalized price. Because the idea is, for example, if I have to fly up here for a conference and the Swedish saving banks have to pay the travel fees for it, SAS could probably charge me 1,000 euros for this flight. Because it's the only flight today, I'll book this flight no matter what. If they only have that information of why do you go there, just basically the announcement of this event or so, they could already target a price at me that would be much, much higher than anybody else. And just that tiny information of that person is going up there for a conference totally changes my behavior or my relationship with a company, and you can then have personalized pricing and so on. The other way around, for example, I do not know if this airplane is totally empty. Like, if I would know, oh my God, no one is on this plane, they totally have to kind of sell these tickets because there's no one there anyways, then I would probably wait for a week and wait until the prices go down. And just these different information they may have about you or you may have about them is totally shifting, for example, something what we call a free market. Like, our market works because we feel like there's one price level and there is like basically a fair price because there's one big market where everybody has the same information. If you now have individual transactions where everybody has different information, suddenly one person pays 500 euros for something where the other person pays 50 euros because they just know you need it right now. And in the other case, the person would probably never buy it if it wouldn't be cheap. So there's a lot of these secondary issues around privacy that happen there. What I touched upon already is that all of this is highly cultural. So even within the European bubble, we have very different approaches on privacy. It was interesting when we negotiated these new privacy laws in Brussels, how different countries had totally different opinions on what should go in, what's important, what shouldn't go in, and so on. To give you one example, there is an old case law in the US where they, for the first time, had to explain if telephone communication is private or not. And they talked about the Fourth Amendment in the US. And in that judgment, there is one sentence that kind of made history a bit, is that they said the wires are not part of the house because they say only the house is private, or the office any more than the highways along which they are stretched. So in the 1920s, the feeling was no privacy whatsoever in the phone conversation, because as soon as it leaves your house, it's not private anymore. This was changed in the 60s, then in 64, so there's a judgment in the US that changed it around. However, we still have these different cultures, and we now have one global internet. And that's one of the reasons why these cultures oftentimes clash. Some things that may feel highly private in Austria may not feel private, let's say in Sweden. We had that debate oftentimes. And that may be very different to China, to the US, and so on. So that's kind of interesting because privacy is very cultural, and it clashes then if it becomes one global internet. Another issue that we come across is obviously government surveillance. So it's not just companies that do stuff, but the government. Obviously, there's the whole Snowden saga that basically disclosed how the international cables are covered by the US to a large extent, but many other countries as well that basically tap into these international data flows to then get information. There's not much abuse that we know about so far compared to what's really possible. I can give you one example. For example, in Austria, they had activists for animal rights that they tapped on, and basically they were tracking for years and years with GPS trackers and all crazy stuff. All of that was illegal, as we found out later, but these people were in court for about a year. They all lost their job and lost basically their livelihood because the costs of the court procedure were a couple of €100,000, and they didn't have the money, and they basically went bankrupt. They all were acquitted. No one of them was ever found to have done anything criminal. That's kind of the smaller cases we sometimes see. And a lot of that was data-driven, where they basically said, oh, you've been 2 miles from a place where something happened because we saw you on the GPS tracker and blah, 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 so you must have had something to do with it. But they never had hard evidence, but this kind of soft evidence that they got out of data they were using. If you look at, for example, the surveillance stuff that happens with the NSA, some of that data is at least said to be part of the data they use, for example, for targeted killings. So that's the probably other extreme of cases where data can be used against a person. And that's the reason in many cases you should probably think about what happens to stuff. Obviously, then there are the big companies. There are all the Googles and Apples and Facebooks and so on. And many of them basically have a kind of a monopoly on data. Like, I don't know, today basically most people are, I guess, on Instagram and so on, but usually my generation was Facebook at the time. If you were not there, you were not invited anymore. You were basically not part of the group. So there's a certain thing that many of these systems have de facto monopolies. In many countries, I don't know how it's like in Norway, there's also kind of these credit ranking agencies. I don't know if you know Little Britain with Computer Says No, but they are oftentimes like a national monopoly as well. Like in Germany, that's very dominant. There is Schufa, and if you have a bad score there, you don't even get a rental agreement anymore. Like you basically, before you get a rental agreement, you have to show your score, and if the score is bad, then you simply don't get an apartment. And so they are private entities oftentimes, but they de facto become a national monopoly, and if they score you bad, then you're very limited in what you can do. A lot of that is then connected to what I call like a public-private partnership. So the government does their surveillance, the companies do their own stuff, but more and more governments across the world got the idea, oh, let's just connect that. The best example was the NSA PRISM program, where basically the NSA in the US is allowed to pull the data from all different US companies as long as it's not a US citizen and analyze it for tons of different reasons. We have a court case on that right now pending, but what you see is that the rationale is it's not the government that has to be in each phone anymore, but if Google and Apple is in each phone, because basically there are only these two smartphone companies or smartphone operating systems, if you basically tap into their servers then you've got basically access to every phone in the world. And that's very interesting because this separation of there's government surveillance and there's private surveillance is factually imploding because it's basically connected now after all. There are other like smaller cases. For example, I once had a bank transaction. A friend of mine was stupid enough to put drug money as the purpose for the transaction, which was a joke from his side. And it wasn't too funny as like the bank called me up later and they were like, we have some, problems here and blah, blah, blah. And it took like months and months and they had to kind of test it. And it turned out later that it's a government rule apparently in the EU that they have to scan all the transactions for like possible, black money or whatever. It's like, if anybody ever really transfers drug money, they probably don't put drug money as the purpose. But anyways, but that is stuff where, again, you have kind of basically an outsourcing of surveillance to private parties because it's not necessarily the bank that cares much about my transactions. But in this case, it's a rule by the government that they have to do that. All of that is a bit connected to the big data phenomenon that I just want to quickly touch on. So we used to have these huge data piles, like in my case, this 1,200 pages. And the interesting thing is that that's not just the data that's there, so the raw data that you put in, but you can oftentimes calculate more things out of that data. There's going to be a couple of Facebook examples later, but basically what you do in this big data analytics is that you try to make data out of data. So people think, oh, I only posted my location or so, but connected to the location, you may figure out, oh, that person is probably, I don't know, lower income because they are usually in a poorer neighborhood. Or that may be connected to political information. Oh, there was like a big strike at the time and they're located at that area where there was like some strike going on. So they may be tied to that situation. An example that came out of the US that was rather interesting is that there was it's a long story, but basically Target, which is a US supermarket company, targeted their commercials to a person, and she was pregnant at the time and her dad saw the advertisement and didn't know that her daughter is pregnant. But Target already did from her bills, basically. They were able to calculate from what she bought that she was pregnant, which is something no one really thinks about. Like, it was not, buying Pampers or whatever, or like, baby stuff or whatever. It's apparently other changes in behavior when you buy groceries that then indicate that you're pregnant. And I don't know how 100% accurate that story is, but I can show you other stuff in my own data where you can see a lot of these things quite well. Long story short, what's interesting is people have that idea of if I don't post something online, then you don't know it. But usually out of big data generation, you can figure out much more than the person posts themselves. Because you connect it to friends, you connect it to what other people do, interaction patterns and so on, and then you can have these big data analytics. All of this leads to a certain power shift, as I said before, so it's basically shifting information to bigger guys and that shifts power to them. So what I think is going to be interesting to talk about is kind of something what I call informational redistribution, so kind of thinking about how can we get information from the upper levels down again and make sure not too much data is flowing up. In simple ways. So it's a bit like when we have a capitalistic society, we usually have certain amounts of taxes and so on to make sure we redistribute wealth in a way that it kind of stays equal somehow. And I think for information, we could probably do something similar like that. We're just starting in that direction, but on the one hand, we obviously have these privacy rights that make sure that not too much data goes up to large companies, for example, or the government. On the other hand, we also have rights like the Freedom of Information Act or these rights to access where you can get a copy of your own data, where you kind of see what they do with your stuff. So you kind of have some information flowing back down again. And I think that's interesting to think about that in a bigger picture like that. In practice, we have tons of problems why all of this doesn't work. One of them is obviously this kind of click and agree kind of thing. There's usually no way that you can actually enforce your rights properly. We have basically walled gardens and kind of monopoly systems where you can hardly move over to another network. Like if you don't like Instagram, you can hardly take your friend somewhere else. You may go to another platform, but then you're the only person there, and liking your own pictures is not the most social experience the world has ever seen. So there's a lot of like other issues around that are reasons why these things do not work overly well. On the solutions, I'm just going to quickly jump that part because I just wanted to go into the Facebook data itself. A lot of the stuff is older, but it shows quite well what these general principles I was talking about before do in practice. So we had a couple of issues. Obviously, I tried to get access to my data. I tried to get a copy of all the data, and I got 1,200 pages, but it's probably just a small fraction of what they really have. There was that pile back then. It was like this size in paper. And if you look, for example, at that pattern, you just have to get the colors basically here. There are different people asking for their data, and green is when you got the data, red is when you didn't get the data. So if you ask for the same stuff, depending on when you ask and how you ask, you suddenly got your information and you didn't get your information. So even this right that I get a copy of all my data, Facebook is not following through at all. Right now there's, for example, a download tool online where you can download your information, and that has probably half of the data that I got 10 years ago. And I was just talking to a Google guy yesterday. They're like, yeah, we know it's not everything in the Google tool either. We try to do our best to probably give you what you want to have. And it's like, it's an actual right. They have to give you 100%, but they just factually don't do it because no one sues them, nothing ever happens. So they basically do a half solution and then try to get away with it. Another thing that we saw were so-called shadow profiles. So what's that is basically, with many of these apps, you have to give them access to your phone book. So if you install an app, it asks to access all of your phone book to then connect you with your friends. And that's unfortunately in German because I don't have it in English anymore, but the last sentence here says, please make sure that your friends agree to the use of their data. And obviously we only push the button after we call 300 friends to actually agree that our data is going up there. And by the way, when you ever read a privacy policy or privacy notice, always read the last sentence first, because usually that's where the juicy stuff is, because people don't read that far. Anyway, so what these companies do is that they basically import data from different sources, and in Facebook's case, we actually could prove that they built what we call the shadow profile. So what's that is basically that we have a person. That person may be a Facebook user or not a Facebook user. So even if you're not a Facebook user, they have a profile on you, which is especially interesting because this idea of, oh, you're just offline and you're off the grid does not work anymore in an interconnected society. If all of your friends around have Facebook and they share your data with it, they have your data as well. And if you have that person, and let's say 3 people work at a certain company or voted for a certain party or go to a certain school, you have a very high likeliness that that person in the center went to the same school, votes for the same political party, and goes to the same, works at the same place. Because otherwise you wouldn't know that these many people. So if you have like 100 colleagues also at the university, then they kind of know you're working at this university very likely without ever you being even on Facebook. And same thing is true, for example, for political affiliation. People usually mingle with people that have the similar political beliefs. So even though you never put your political beliefs online, you can basically calculate that out of this data. And to give you that practical example, that's my friends list. That's the ID numbers of all of my friends at the time. And they put that together in like bubbles. And you can see I'm the yellow dot in the middle, and that's all my different friends. And you see that they are built certain networks. It's basically your, friendship parts. And I was, for example, an ambulance driver in Salzburg at the Red Cross instead of going to the military in Austria. And that's all my friends from there. I never put in that I was an ambulance driver. But you can calculate it out of the friends because all of them put in, I was working at the ambulance at the time, and that's exactly the time these friendship relationships started. So you can basically calculate that. I was working for different exchange organizations. That's my different university schools and so on. And what's interesting is that bubble up there that doesn't have anything, the red one up there, that's basically all my gay friends. And I never put my sexual orientation into Facebook, but half of them put their partners in, and there are all the kind of different parties that they go to and so on. So if I open, for example, in Vienna, my parties you may want to go, it's basically one gay event after the other that pops up. Not because I put in I want to go there, but because friends go there and they calculate back to you. And it's accurate. It's in this case working real well. But it's interesting because even stuff like your sexual orientation is not, you cannot hide it anymore. And even if you never put it online, you can basically calculate it from that information. From that, let's jump to the next thing. Another thing that's really interesting is the whole tracking part. Usually many of these companies, especially the large companies, now have different ways of tracking you off their pages. So for example, Google has Google Analytics that's usually built into almost every page in the world. Facebook has these social plugins that where you can like something or share it on Instagram. I mean, Instagram is part of Facebook as well. It's one big company. Or you can also share it on like WhatsApp and so on. The interesting thing what they do in the background is that if you visit a page like that, there are so-called cookies in the browser. And through the cookies, they can track who is watching what page at what time. And for example, this data set is a friend's data set. And the cookie up there, it's her name, Lisa. And then it's that cookie that was shown up that showed up 365 times, and she's the only person that ever logged in from that computer. So they know this computer belongs to that person, and therefore whenever that computer shows up on the internet, they know that that person is very likely sitting behind it. It's not 100%. It could be someone else sitting behind that computer for a second, but basically they can figure out what device belongs to what person at what time that way. That's the other two devices that she was using are in the other two green boxes. What does all of this do is basically if you have a web page, you have these like buttons, but they're usually not part of the web page, but they're actually a so-called iframe that is a cutout from the page that is filled by Facebook in that moment. The same thing is true for Google and other companies that do similar things. And it also looks a bit different depending on what cookies you have installed. It changes a bit with the text that it has. But what it in essence does is that it exactly tells Facebook who was visiting what page at what time. And that also allows them to track interests off the page, like not just liking something on Facebook, which is obvious. But for example, we found these things on porn pages. And like underneath each naked video, there was like one of these like buttons. So they could basically track who was watching what porn, how long. Which is not necessarily what people probably expect from a page like that. Similarly, we looked into messages. In my case, it was especially interesting how much was shared in messages because it's a situation where people feel like they're sharing with a friend. So for example, a close friend of mine, she was in the closed unit of the psychological hospital in Vienna because she had like serious issues. And they were not allowed to use anything like a cell phone or so, but they were allowed to use Facebook. So she was Facebook messaging me. And a lot of her like emotional issues are now in these Facebook messages. I was actually deleting most of that, but Facebook keeps the deleted information. So it only flags stuff as deleted. It then says deleted, and underneath the deleted stuff comes along. And it was interesting in this case because I was just basically typing in different Austrian political parties, demonstrations, being sick, stuff like that. And you could find all these kind of sensitive information right in the messages because you're like, yeah, I'm going to vote for this guy. That's actually the one down here is who I'm going to vote for. That's the one down in the second row. The upper one was when I was sick. I mean, that's not probably the most sensitive information the world has ever seen. But here, basically, this message was actually physically deleted by me. But when I got the data from Facebook, suddenly it was back there. And it explicitly says who I was voting for at an election. And I was only sharing that with one friend in a private conversation, and it's impossible to delete anymore. Another one was these apps. So Facebook allowed at the time that you installed different apps, and it was usually some kind of like win a car app or whatever. And we made a complaint in 2011 already that basically your name, gender, ID number, and so on of your friends goes up. So if that blue guy is connecting to the app, all the data of all the friends goes to the app as well. And so if just any one of your friends installs an app like that, your data goes up to that third-party app. And these apps were not approved. Like no one knew where they were. I installed an app. I made one up and was like, I have an app. Woohoo, I get data. No one ever asks you who you are. You don't have to show an ID. You don't have to show where you are. So it may go to North Korea. You don't even know where. And at the time, we filed a complaint in 2011 saying this is kind of crazy because all this friends data goes up there. We don't know where it all goes, and this could be used for like terrible things. And at the time, Facebook said it's no problem. We don't see what you could ever use it for, what the problem could possibly be. The Irish regulator closed the case, said there is nothing that could ever happen here. And 3 or 4 years later, Cambridge Analytica had this great idea of using apps like that to pull all the Facebook data up. And a couple of years later, that was used for the Trump election. And that's the whole Cambridge Analytica scandal that exactly used that path that we pointed out 4 or 5 years earlier, which then became a big privacy scandal, which Facebook totally knew about 7 years before it was a scandal. But at the time, they felt there couldn't possibly be a problem. And it's kind of funny if you're a 23-year-old law student, you're pointing out an issue like that, and like 7 years later, they have Congress hearings on it. And it kind of shows how there is really no real understanding of these problems on that side. Last point that's kind of interesting is geodata. So they also get data from geographic locations. For example, if you upload a picture, it oftentimes has attached the GPS data of where that picture was taken. So you see that down here, that's basically the latitude and longitude of that picture. If you then have 10 people in the picture, then Facebook knows where these 10 people have been at what time. So a friend of mine, she had like an old Nokia phone at the time without any kind of GPS capabilities or whatever. And she had about 20 or 30 locations in Vienna where she was, and you could totally see what's her neighborhood, where she's usually around, even though she's never shared any of that personally. But because of other people sharing her location through, for example, pictures, you were able to find these things. Same thing you can also do with IP addresses. So for example, in my situation, there is a data set on Facebook, which is last location, which is where they think you've been the last time when they got any information about you. And in my case, that was, for example, my university, because I logged in from a computer at the university. They know that this computer is at that university, so they know you've been at that place at the time. Similarly, with other IP addresses, they, for example, were able to you're able to track whole patterns of like hotels where you've been. That's basically a travel around the U.S. where you see each like Holiday Inn Express, Pacifica, blah blah blah, San Luis Obispo, California. So you kind of know that people have been at that hotel that night. The one down here is kind of funny. It's just Hong Kong because I was in China before, and in China Facebook is blocked, so there's no tracks of that. Yep, I already talked about US surveillance. That's part of the whole thing as well. I think I would leave it at that, because then we have about 10 minutes to probably have questions and comments and answers and fears and all of these things. Thank you. And someone has to go ahead with the first question. I'm always joking, it's like the more you go to Northern Europe, the less questions there are, so you have to kind of overcome the stereotype that I already made up. Right there, probably. Yep. That's the problem, it's the time issue. So the solution part basically is this little logo on the right on my side. I can go back for a tiny bit to probably answer it right away. So basically what we have as an option is basically enforcement. I think in Europe we have pretty strong laws. We can basically enforce these things quite well. The problem is that we don't really have enforcement. That's basically the best picture to show that. That is the Irish Data Protection Regulator. That's the guy that regulates all of Europeans' privacy if it comes to Google, Facebook, LinkedIn, all the big companies. And this is a supermarket, and the blue door at the right is the regulator. And that's the fundamental problem we have. We have all these rules and laws, and that's, I think, a fundamental European problem. Laws are done in Brussels and on a European level, but the enforcement is done by the member states. And we have some member states that just inherently do not enforce EU law. If it's tax law, privacy law, whatever it is. And Ireland is just one of them. And they now have a new office and they have more people, but I can also give you the statistics. That's until 2012, but it's the same until then. The blue line on the top is all the complaints they receive, and the red line right underneath this is all the complaints they have never dealt with. So only about 2 to 4% of the complaints a year are even investigated, and usually they go nowhere. And that's the fundamental problem, that we have regulators that don't really do much about it. Just jumping ahead. Basically what we do as an NGO now is to try to connect these people, to enforce these things directly. So under EU law, there is this Article 80 of the GDPR, and that allows NGOs to actually enforce stuff directly. So there is a way that we can bring model cases, that we can sue companies, that we can do all of these things to actually get stuff done. And I think that is the most likely thing to ever work. And by the way, we even have one Norwegian guy right now, the blonde guy in the back, that is working with us. So we're trying to do that on a European level to kind of connect it all. I hope that answers the question. And I've even squeezed in the rest of the presentation somehow. And I think other stuff, like there's a lot of talk about education and telling people how what the problems are. And I think the fundamental issue is it's so complex that I don't understand how Facebook fully works. And we have a huge problem in the area that basically the industry says we have to educate people more and they have to make educated choices. But the reality is people work 8 hours a day, then they go home and want to order a pizza and don't want to read 300 pages of privacy statements and then make an informed choice. And that's not how we regulate other things. Like we usually, if it's building codes, we all sit in this wonderful place and we think that, this structure up here is holding up somehow because someone has checked that and knows what they're doing. And it's not like we have to test it and be sure that, this is all fine before we walk in. I think we have to do the internet a bit like that we just have certain rules that make sure that shitty things do not happen and then enforce them properly that, we can use stuff without worrying 24/7. I hope that answers the question somehow and allowed me to squeeze the rest back in. And there was one question back there. Yeah. Yeah, there are technical solutions. There are certain solutions where I think technology can work. You can host your stuff yourself. You can, there is encryption. There is tons of these things. And that is definitely a way for many problems to solve them. If you just basically technically block other people out, then they can't have it. But it's a bit, there are certain parts where this is not possible. Simply if all your friends upload your data, then your encryption is not going to be very helpful. And so I usually try to encourage people to use stuff like Signal instead of WhatsApp, which is like the same functionality, same thing, but it's properly encrypted and it doesn't belong to any big company. There's a lot of like these alternatives that you can use if you want to, also enable other people to even communicate with you on another channel. So that's usually something that we can do ourselves. There are certain options with encryption and so on. I think in the long run, however, it's a bit of a situation where these technical solutions I'm the lawyer here, so I may have my very personal legal view here, but it seems sometimes like, if you have too many murders in the street, the solution is not to drive around in tanks, but to make sure that people don't kill each other that much. So I'm more on that side usually of it. But obviously it's a bit like, you also want to lock your door probably. And I think that mix is probably something that would help us overall. Another huge issue as a solution is breaking up monopolies online. We have basically a monopolization of the internet. The whole idea of the internet, it's an open space that is interoperable where every company can, every page can communicate with each other. You can send an email from each email provider to the other and it's all one open network. And now on top of that infrastructure, we now have kind of closed networks where you can only message within WhatsApp. You cannot send a message over to anybody else. And that builds monopolies over the time because there's a network effect and once something has a crucial mass, everybody else is joining that system. And there is no possibility that like a better social network could ever take over because realistically, you're never gonna get like hundreds of thousands of people to move over to another platform that quickly. And so even if you have like a better social network, they usually cannot compete because of a lack of interoperability. And that's something we could regulate. Like that's something where we could say, okay, there needs to be an open interface so that you can use another network, but still be friends with your people on, let's say, Instagram. And you still see their postings, but you use something else, and you can still message them, but you're on your own platform that you like better. And that is something that we could do, and we do that in all other areas, like we opened up gas and electricity and all these other networks. So you can choose from 100 telephone providers usually. And that is more of a thing that politically we would have to push for. And that goes beyond privacy. It's also hugely important for industry and so on, that they can compete again. Especially for like a small market like in Europe, it's oftentimes not possible to ever compete size-wise with big global companies. And I think that would be a solution to even allow innovative alternatives to ever catch on. But more questions? Yep.
To what extent do you see that Facebook changes their policy based on privacy issues?
Not at all. To a large extent, not at all. There are certain things that are an outrage in the US where they actually change a bit, like if it comes to political advertisement, stuff like that. But for example, after GDPR, they do not comply with GDPR at all, what they did is in the midnight of GDPR, so with the new law, to explain it that way, you have to have informed specific consent. So there has to be a yes or no box. You have to ask, do you want all your data to be used for advertisement? And then there has to be a yes or no button, basically. And what they did is to avoid this issue, because they knew probably that a bunch of people would not click yes, they said this is now part of the contract, which is another possibility under GDPR. You can say it's either consent or contract and other things. So what they did is they moved the consent thing into a contract and said, now you don't have any choice anymore because we made it part of the contract, which is totally illegal and just like impossible to do. But they will fight that now for 5 or 6 years in the courts. And that means for another 5 or 6 years, GDPR technically does not apply to them because they just decided to interpret it differently. At the same time, they walk around and say, we're 100% compliant and we totally love privacy and it's great. But they really don't do that. Same thing with that Google guy yesterday. We just had a meeting in Brussels yesterday on how to follow these rules. And they walk around for years and years and say, oh, we totally love the right to access. You can totally get all your data at Google. We have a great tool and we put so much engineering in it and we're so innovative, blah, blah, blah. Most of the data is simply not in it. It's just factually not there. And if you then confront them with it, it's like, yeah, you know, there's something that's not in it, and, you know, we're trying to get better, and, you know, it's very complicated. And, you know, the law is here for 4 years, and Google really, like, if anybody knows how to put data together, it's them. But it's very interesting how their public PR speech is just drastically different from anything that they do in practice. And I mean, that reality catches on, and everybody realizes after a while. But I think for a lot of it is still superficial changes, because they would have to change their core business model to a certain extent. And if the core business model is stripping everybody of your data and then selling it on, then you obviously are in conflict with the law. And that's different in the industry sectors. We have better experiences with Apple, for example. When you look at their privacy policies, they're definitely much more compliant. And they do have the buttons as they should be, because they make money because you pay $1,000 for the phone. And for example, Android does not get, Google does not get anything from Android. Basically, if you pay an Android phone, the money goes to the manufacturer of the phone, and Android is put on for free by Google. So they need to make money somehow else. And that oftentimes connects with like company structures or how a company philosophy is like. So usually with, for example, Microsoft is much older. They have a certain way of making money for years and years. They're in all the computers anyways, so they're usually way less aggressive on these things. If you look at their privacy policies and what they argue, I mean, there's a lot of it that probably you couldn't do either, but it's by far not as aggressive. And I think that's also interesting to see how they are a bit different. It's not one thing. If you look at Europe, for example, the credit ranking agencies are extremely aggressive in some countries. In other countries, they are totally like compliant and small. That's also country by country a bit different of how business models developed over years and how much that became part of the society. And that's interesting as we work on a European level. You're like, have 5 lawyers in the room, and one's like, oh my God, these guys are crazy. And they're like, in our country, they're not. And then you see how they're actually very different and still make money different ways. So that's also interesting, because you can show you can actually make money without doing the crazy stuff at the same time. And that's oftentimes like very different on each of them. Anybody else?
Are you on social media?
I am on social media. I'm on all of them. I actually like Twitter the most. That's the one thing I actually use. But I also use Facebook and so on. I think if you got any kind of negative influence of what I told you today, don't go offline. I think the solution is not that we just kind of run away and go offline and just don't use technology. It's a bit like if there's new technology, we have to make sure it's safe and it works properly. And I think like a lot of that makes a lot of sense to communicate. And I have all my friends abroad on Facebook and so on. And the solution is not necessarily to just abandon it and go back to your cave and just have like a landline phone and nothing else. But I think the solution is that we make them comply with the law, and that should, in let's say 10 years, get us to a world where things work reasonably well. And it's a bit like with any other new technology. It's a bit like when cars came around, people were afraid that they're gonna get killed and so on, and after a while there were airbags and safety belts and so on, and then after a while you feel like cars are a reasonable thing, especially once they're electric like here. Thanks a lot.